The Knights Templar were destroyed in the 14th century, but did some of them secretly escape to Scotland and found the Freemasons? The origins of the Knights Templar are incredibly humble and actually not all that mysterious. They basically just came about because of the Crusades. Around the year 1099, Jerusalem was taken from Muslim hands by Christian armies. On the surface, that seemed great for Christendom, and pilgrims from Europe could take the journey to go and visit the holy city of Jerusalem. But the reality wasn't quite as straightforward. The journey from mainland Europe to Jerusalem to the Holy Land was a dangerous undertaking. Dr. Edward Coleman from University College Dublin told Smithsonian that the pilgrims needed an armed escort.
And the Templars are organized effectively to provide that escort.
It was a problem that the French nobleman Hugh de Payens wanted to solve, so somewhere around 1118 or 1119, he created a group sworn to protect the Christian pilgrims. He named his new brotherhood the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and the Temple of Solomon, later known as the Knights Templar or just Templars, and thus one of history's most intriguing and powerful orders was born. Part of what allowed the Templars to become so powerful and successful was their code of conduct. World History Encyclopedia likens them to a monastic order, and that's not entirely wrong, as initiates took their vows upon entry and then abided by a set of guidelines called the Rule. That started with their clothing, a white cloak adorned with a red cross. White was a symbol of purity and chastity, the exact opposite of the flashy armor usually associated with knights. Even something as simple as a belt was replaced with a wool cord, all the function without the passion. No decorative flourishes were allowed, since they signified arrogance. But that wasn't it for the rules. They were beholden to the word of their Grand Master. Permission was required from their superiors to adjust their stirrups, go into town, or even bathe. Chastity was hugely important, and the topic of women was basically taboo. They couldn't kiss female members of their families or even talk about times they had spent with women. Meal times were regulated too. Meals were taken together with two brothers to a bowl, and meat only every other day. And church services were, of course, mandatory. Over time, the Templars gained a reputation as one of the most feared fighting units during the Crusades. They were largely seen as absolutely fearless, and with a code that didn't actually permit them from retreating from battle. Combined with an insane discipline, they were a force to be reckoned with. They were also expertly trained with multiple weapons and exceedingly well equipped, and that was when their cavalry wasn't just decimating the enemy ranks. Dan Jones's The Templars, The Rise and Spectacular Fall of God's Holy Warriors, paints them as a linchpin in the Second Crusade, leading entire armies to battle and fighting on the front lines to conquer the city of Damascus. Combined with their reputation as shrewd tacticians, people living at the time considered them close to legendary.
In an age where countries didn't have standing armies, the Templars were a standing army.
Even though the Knights Templar started as holy warriors, one of the biggest impacts they made wasn't actually made on the battlefield. It was in the pocketbook. According to the BBC, the Templars' financial system functioned a lot like a private bank. Carrying a lot of money on the journey to Jerusalem was dangerous for pilgrims, so instead they could deposit money in a Templar bank in Europe, receive a letter of credit, and then show that letter in Jerusalem, where they could withdraw the money. But the Templars also offered other financial services too, aside from just the simple banking system. For example, King Henry III of England planned to buy the island of Oleron, and the Templars acted as brokers to put that deal together. They acted as high-level pawnbrokers by holding on to the crown jewels as security on a loan. Yes, the crown jewels were in Templar hands for a while. They were also trusted with the finances of other groups. The Pope used the Templars as tax collectors for a while because they could move those funds to the Crusades. They were also used by English and French kings to move money and helped oversee complicated financial matters because they were well known for their honesty and efficiency. The guidelines set out by the Knights Templar technically mandated that its members embrace poverty, but the reality didn't really look like that. The truth was quite the contrary. The Templars as a group were insanely rich.
The Crusaders were just blown away by what they found in the Middle East, and they took a lot of it back with them.
Part of that came from their fights on the front lines. Rules laid out by the Pope meant that they could keep the riches they found from lands they conquered, but another big part of it came from donations, as donating funds to Templars was seen as protection for the donor's eternal soul. It was also protection for their mortal bodies, as it's a way for people to prove their dedication to the Crusades without actually fighting. It wasn't just money that people donated to the Templars, it was also land. At their height, the Templars owned lands all across Europe. Their estates were scattered throughout Portugal and France, as well as England, Ireland, Spain, Germany, Italy, and many more countries. Plus, they also held on to a handful of castles and strategic locations in the Holy Land, stretching as far north as Antioch and nearly as far south as Egypt. They also owned the island of Cyprus for a while. The Templars bought the island from the then King of England, Richard the Lionheart, in 1192, but did not go well. The inhabitants of Cyprus revolted against the Templars' harsh rule and besieged the small Templar contingent on the island, who had to fight their way out to freedom before ultimately giving most of the island back to Richard. The power of the Templars is also really well exemplified by the people they associated with, because while most of the individual Templars aren't really named in the history books, they counted kings and popes among their allies. That was the case right from the beginning. Baldwin II, the king of Jerusalem, when the Templars were founded, took an immediate liking to the order, giving them the use of his palace on Temple Mount in 1120, better known as the Temple of Solomon, and the place where the Templars first got their name. About a decade later, they were officially recognized by the Pope and the Catholic Church, and also had the backing of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, a prominent French abbot who wrote texts in their favor. Their connections only grew from there. They had close ties to English royalty, and Richard the Lionheart in particular, who personally called on them to be his tithe collectors. They were especially close with French kings as well. When Louis IX was short on funds, the Templars saw to it that they played a role in getting his armies to Egypt, and when he was captured, the Templars again intervened, this time to pay his ransom. What really sets the Templars apart from other secret societies is their relationship to the law. Thanks to the power granted to them by the Church, in many countries they were essentially above the law. Along with papal backing came a papal bull in 1139. The language is flowery, but the decree heaps a lot of praise on the Templars while intimately tying them to the power of the Pope. With that power came privilege. They alone were entitled to any of the spoils of war which they earned while fighting against the Muslim armies. None of that had to go back to any other country, and the Templars could use those riches as they saw fit. They were completely exempt from paying any sort of taxes, and their papal protection essentially meant they weren't held to the rule of any kind of local authority. Kings, queens, emperors, didn't matter. The Templars only had to listen to the word of the Pope. By the late 13th century, the Crusades were nearly over. Muslim armies had taken back Jerusalem in 1187, and while Christian armies from Europe attempted repeatedly over the next century to reclaim the city, they met with less and less success. And as support for the Crusades dwindled, criticisms of the Templars' wealth and power began to rise. In October 1307, King Philip IV of France decided to capitalize on the growing distrust of the Templars to eliminate them. He had ulterior motives. He was deeply in debt to the Templars. By destroying them and seizing their assets, he could not only eliminate that debt, but also enrich himself greatly. He also had a trump card. Just 2 years earlier, he had installed Clement V as a new pope, operating out of France under Philip's thumb.
By the 1300s, the Templars had grown too powerful, too threatening. So the Vatican issued secret orders.
Philip arrested all the major Templars, including their Grand Master Jacques de Molay. They were then tortured and forced to sign bogus confessions to a laundry list of sins, including heresy, sodomy, and financial corruption. In 1310, a trial led to over 50 Templars being burned at the stake. And in 1312, Philip pressured Pope Clement V into officially dissolving the Templars. 2 years later, de Molay and many of his fellow Templars were executed, bringing the order to a terrible end. Even though the modern perspective sees the Templars as a secret society, during their time they weren't just operating in public, but were famous across the Western world. After all, it's hard to think that a well-oiled military machine which could help facilitate wars would really be able to go completely undetected and under the radar. So why are they considered a secret society? Well, much of it has to do with how the Templars operated, as many of their internal operations were kept secret, something that eventually helped facilitate their downfall, as it was easy to spread sinister rumors about them. Their initiation rituals in particular really came under fire. Friends and family weren't invited to them, and of course that made others believe that the practices were suspect. When the Templars were forced under torture to confess, they claimed the initiation ritual included spitting on the cross and denying Christ, among other things. Really though, the ritual was nothing near that. It was just a series of questions and vows. Still though, questions abound. In 2017, the Caton Caves were rediscovered and photographed, showing the world a labyrinth of carved caverns. While many historians believe the caverns date to the 19th century, others believe they date back as far as the Templars and their secret religious rituals. Like many things about the Templars though, it's hard to sort truth from myth. Despite having been dissolved in the early 14th century, the Knights Templar still managed to capture the wonder and imagination of the modern world, and really that seems to speak to a very particular kind of power, even if that's not political influence or military might. Even 700 years after the death of the last Grand Master, myths and legends still abound. Conspiracy theorists can have a field day with questions over the relics the Templars may or may not have had in their possession. No, they never had the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant, or actual pieces of the cross from the crucifixion in their hands. But it's fascinating to imagine that they might have. To go to something slightly more grounded, there are myths of a Templar treasure hoard. which one member claimed under torture had been taken to some mysterious place just before the persecution they faced in the 1300s. Supposedly, a small Templar fleet sailed away at the time to parts unknown. But is it true? And if so, where did they go? Some conspiracy theorists believe they went to Scotland and inspired the Freemasons, but so far no evidence has been found to prove the treasure fleet even existed. The Templars have lived on for centuries since their official dissolution in the public imagination, whether through the creation of contemporary branches, works of fiction like the Da Vinci Code or the Assassin's Creed franchise, or through the intrigue of scholars and anyone who likes a little history. It's a pretty cool legacy, to say the least.